Okay, guys, hope you had a nice little break. I gotta tell you, I really enjoy doing this primarily because when I'm not doing it, I'm having to work so hard, man. I'm home every day. Get up in the morning, I've got to unload the dishwasher, I have to cook breakfast, I have to cook lunch, I have to cook dinner, I got to unload the dryer, I got to fold the clothes. I swear my wife is treating me like I'm Cinderella.
Chris, are you talking about me again?
Oh no, hon, just thanking you for all the good things that you've been doing for the class.
Better not be, but when you're done, I have a list for you.
Okay, honey. Just goofing. And indeed, my wife even wrote these cards for me, okay? So she has been extremely helpful, to say the least. Okay, for this little section, I want to do another shout out if I can. You know, really missing all of you guys, of course. And here, this is Tuesday, Thursday 101. So Rosa, Bernabe, Harrison, Secali, sorry, I always have a hard time with that. Dana, Eva, Joe, Dakota, Giselle, Seth, Alexis, Alyssa, Sophie, Blake, Noelle, Moses, Rourke, Anna, Gregory, Sun, Joshua, Anthony, Tiana, Bianca, Calvin, Kathleen, Brianna, Nicole, Thomas, Matthew, Diego, Valeria, Raul, Angela, Kelsey, Cecilia, Savannah, Samantha, Dustin, McKenna, Emmanuel, David, Jose, Chelsea, Dylan, Gavin, and Lizzie. Hey Lizzie, how you doing? Anyway, I hope you guys are doing okay. I hope it's going well for you. I hope it's not too difficult having to pay attention to these presentations. I will tell you, of course, when we get to the end of the section, this is going to be the end for our second midterm. Okay, so. What I told you, of course, was the build-up there was something is going to be signed on July the 4th, 1776. And of course, I hope you guys know that that's the Declaration of Independence. Now, there's just a few things I wanted you guys to be aware of in terms of the Declaration. One thing that I really do like to suggest to you is just, that it's a really beautiful document. Just the beauty of the words. And this is all Thomas Jefferson kind of putting this together. And it has that kind of sort of beautiful flow. And I hope you guys will forgive me if I just read from the Declaration for you guys. Anyone who wants a copy of this can, of course, get it really quickly. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. All one sentence, but just powerful. But here's, of course, the most powerful statement. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Amazingly, that pretty much is one sentence too. Okay, but this is going to be the foundation of the United States. This is a seminal document of the United States of America. So it becomes really important, of course, that that it's stated in a way that just has a tremendous amount of dignity to say that. So I do want you to understand kind of the basic beauty of the Declaration. I also want you to know, however, that a lot of what the Declaration says is kind of bogus. There are a series of claims that are made, and this is all just, of course, justification as far as why the Americans are seeking their independence. So let me just go through a little bit of this, and we do begin to see kind of a level of exaggeration. So here it says, the history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let the facts be submitted to a candid world. So this says that the King of England has tried to establish an absolute tyranny through all these injuries and usurpations. Now, I told you the story of why the Americans broke with Great Britain, but I don't remember that part of the story, where the king is establishing an absolute tyranny. I did tell you that the British tried to tax them a little bit, but they repealed those taxes. I did tell you that the British tried to, of course, administer them a little bit, but none of that seemed to be very effective. So clearly, they're exaggerating the situation, and I understand. You're trying to make your point and trying to make it powerful. And I do like. Here's one thing. The claims are kind of outrageous. However, there's always a kernel of truth in everything they say. So what follows that section is a long list of kind of the crimes of the king. Essentially, I'm not going to tell you all of them, but he has dissolved represented houses repeatedly. So this is, of course, like when they try to prorogue the Massachusetts General Assembly. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people. So that's, of course, like the people who were supposed to collect the taxes, or the Vice Admiralty courts. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies. So the garrisoning of the soldiers, of course, in Boston is what he's talking about. And then it's also the quartering of large bodies of armed troops among us. So the same thing as far as Boston was concerned. He has cut off our trade with all parts of the world. Now, that only occurred for Boston, right? They shut Boston off for the rest, but it didn't occur generally as far as the colonies are concerned. He has imposed taxes upon us without our consent, and yet none of those taxes really held, okay? So that's at least a little bit interesting. He has suspended our own legislatures. It's the same thing, of course, the proroguing. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. That's kind of, the bombing of Maine. Well, here's it says, he has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. That really is just what happened in Portland, Maine. That's when that happened. He is transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries amongst us, of course, so those are the Hessians. He has incited domestic insurrection among us, and that's the offer to free the slaves. So, there's a little bit of truth behind every single thing, but they're not quite as big as it sounds, essentially, in terms of the Declaration. But let me just, finish this, because in here again we get back to kind of the beauty of the words. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America. So that's the first time that is stated in any form of legal document. In General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world. I don't know if you guys know, but a lot of Thomas Jefferson was a deist, so he's not going to say God here. Instead it's kind of the supreme being kind of thing that will be reflected here. Appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intention, do in the name of and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. And I always want to read the last sentence here because it's a powerful suggestion. And for support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, so again, a kind of interesting reference to God or Supreme Being, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor, and is signed by John Hancock and 54 others. Now, I always like to mention that last sentence there because we assume that everything's going to go well, and it did go well for them, we know that. But just imagine if this hadn't gone well. Well, the guys who put their names, of course, on the Declaration would be traitors, and they would be taken and hung from the neck till dead. I mean, they were pledging their lives in that moment. It was an act of relative danger. I always like to tell you that when they published it, of course, this would be like the printed copies that they would put out there. It only said on the bottom, John Hancock and 54 others. So they didn't make the names of those people readily accessible, except for John Hancock. You'd have to kind of go look a little deeper to find out what was going on there. Anyway, so there's a beauty to the Declaration. There's also kind of a little bit of a bogus quality to it. But I do ultimately want you to understand that this is a revolutionary manifesto. I mean, it is saying things that no document had ever said for the people who lived anywhere in the world until that time. So there's a remarkably revolutionary component to what's going on here. So for instance, just things that it says in here that really are revolutionary in nature. It says that I'm exaggerating here, of course, all people are created equal. It actually says all men are created equal, but it's promoting the concept of equality that ultimately becomes expansive to everyone. And the question is, who believed that? And I have to be honest, I don't think Thomas Jefferson did. He kind of had an abstract notion that in the moment of your birth, everyone is equal, but within minutes after that occurs, of course, the inequalities begin to step in. I mean, this man owned slaves, for crying out loud. But you're putting forward this is just an unalienable fact. Now this is the way it is in the world, in the universe, that all people are equal, essentially. So presenting the concept of equality in a huge way, which was basically not believed by anyone anywhere else in the world, becomes a revolutionary activity as far as the Declaration is concerned. It also says that all governments are based upon the consent of the governed, Well, travel the world and tell me what government was based on the consent of the governed. I mean, did the Russian people consent to the Tsardom? Did the Chinese people consent to the emperor? You know, even did the British, did they consent to the king? None of them did that, right? So this is the first people who are saying that the governments are based upon the people. They're based upon the consent of the people. So this is, again, a revolutionary kind of suggestion, which, you know, is transformative as far as the world is concerned. And finally, you know, one of those final really powerful revolutionary statements, it says that the people have the right to alter or abolish the government should it become injurious of their well-being. I'm not even really sure we believe that right now. I mean, that's a good idea, of course, but you know, our government doesn't necessarily promote the idea that people should be able to alter or abolish it. And we do know that there's a radical element within America that kind of always look to this part, and that might lead to them to some of their violent activities one way or the other. But these are all radically revolutionary notions which are stated as unalienable facts as far as the Declaration is concerned, and that creates this powerful kind of revolutionary dynamic associated with the Declaration. Finally, and critically important, the Declaration of Independence is not simply a declaration of independence, it is also a declaration of war. I mean, the war is now going to start in earnest in many ways, and thus, we have to confront kind of the issues of the war at that moment. Okay, I'm going to tell you about the war kind of as a war. But before I do that, I want to suggest one of the signal problems of America as they entered into this conflict, okay? So I would suggest to you that it might be better to call what was happening in America the divided states of America rather than United States, all right? So some serious divisions within America, the Americans themselves, that cause a tremendous amount of difficulty and will, add enormously to the problems associated with the American Revolution. So America wasn't tremendously united at that time. And I mean, it makes sense in many ways that there had never been anything that had technically connected the colonies together. Really, all their ties were, to Great Britain. Now, they were neighbors with each other, and they interacted with each other, and they traded with each other. But you have to kind of create this notion that they are some kind of united entity, which was difficult for them. Oftentimes, the people felt more that they were Virginians than Americans, or they were more Georgians, or people from New York, of course, than Americans. So, there's a difficulty kind of even creating just general sense that they are a nation. And I'm going to tell you a whole bunch more about that. It's a long-term problem, of course, getting everyone to feel like they're coming together. There were divisions between the North and the South, of course. Attitudes towards slavery were different, and just general economic activities different, North and South. Even more important differences between East and West. The people on the East Coast were seen as the establishment, basically, in terms of America. The people on the West Coast were more, they were the ones, the frontier people, and they felt themselves routinely kind of disconnected. They felt themselves unsupported. They felt themselves, subject to the problems associated with Native Americans. And they often looked to the East Coast people like they were the elites and they were the people who weren't really helping them in any kind of way. So there are divisions here. It's the united component is really not, that's going to have to be kind of born within the war and ultimately even within the aftermath of the war. But of all the divisions that really rent America at that moment, the most important one was essential division of loyalty, of like who you were going to support in this moment. And the word loyalty it's appropriate here, but it's also kind of problematic, and because the people I'm going to tell you about are called the Loyalists. They called themselves, I should say, the Loyalists. And these were people who were Americans who wanted to remain loyal to Great Britain. Not every single American thought that all this was a good idea. In fact, there were dedicated individuals who wanted to stay tied to Great Britain at whatever cost, essentially. So one of the primary problems of the revolution was the presence of these people that we call Loyalists. Now, I wrote Tory down there because that was the way the Patriots described them. And although Tory to you and I doesn't sound like it, in fact, if that's a name, I kind of like it, okay? But in those days, Tory was a political bad word. It's like calling someone a fascist pig, So the Americans, the patriotic Americans, will call these Loyalists the Tories. And by the way, the Loyalists, of course, called the Americans the patriots, the rebels. They thought they were a bunch of rebel rabble, basically. And the presence of the Loyalists will create the foundation for what was almost a civil war as far as the Americans were concerned. So it's not just a conflict against the British. In many ways, it was also an internal conflict between those who wished to stay loyal to Great Britain and those, of course, who sought independence. I'm going to... This is a potential identification, of course, for the second midterm, so I hope I have your attention for that, right? So I'm going to do kind of a simple sort of analysis of the Loyalists, and I'm going to just start with who were the Loyalists? Who were the Loyalists? Now, the first thing I want you guys to know is that they were Americans. You can't claim that they're anybody else. They were Americans. And they came from every colony, now state. They came from every social group, from every walk of life. I mean, basically, it's like a division between Democrats and Republicans today. I mean, there are families that have Democratic members and families that have Republican. It's the way it would be at that time, too. So, who were they? They were Americans. And like I said, there were some states that had more loyalists. So New York tended to have a little bit more. South Carolina. There were some states that had fewer loyalists, like Massachusetts. There were great hostility, but even Massachusetts had loyalists. There's no doubt about that. And intriguingly, families were rent by the fact that there were some that were patriot and loyalists. And one of the most famous divisions here was in the Franklin family. Benjamin Franklin was, of course, a patriot, and his son was a loyalist. And I have to tell you, that led to a monster estrangement. I don't think the two of them talked to each other for over 20 years. It's a serious, serious division, okay? But who were they? They were Americans. Now, I do want to tell you that there were particular groups of Americans who were more likely to be loyalists. So if you were an Anglican minister, if you were part of the Anglican Church, the Church of England, you tended to be loyalist. If you were a merchant with deep economic ties to Great Britain, you tended to be a loyalist. That is true. There were a lot of British soldiers who had been part of the French and Indian War who simply decided to stay in America, and they tended to be loyalists too. Those that were a little closer to Great Britain, they're going to remain loyalists. So, who were the loyalists? They were everybody. They were just about everywhere, essentially. And sometimes very personal, like if you owed money to someone and they were a patriot, you might become a loyalist. Or if your mother-in-law was a patriot, then you might become a loyalist. But, who were they? They were Americans, of course, and they came from just about every single walk of life. The second really interesting, and I think more important question is, why? So why were some of these Americans loyalists when others, of course, were not? And there's a number of reasons here that I want to kind of highlight for you. We do believe that one thing about the Loyalists was that they probably were more conservative. I jumped up. Here's the first one I want you. They were people who felt more connected to Great Britain for whatever reason. And that could be family ties. I mean, think of it. What if your grandmother lived in Great Britain, How easy would it be for you to turn against your grandmother, something like that? So they felt the family ties. They felt the ties of language. They felt the ties of culture. There was just something about them that made them feel more connected to Great Britain than others, So that became kind of one of the foundations, Why were they loyal? Because they felt those connections. Another thing was that we do believe the Loyalists were more conservative. So a conservative person just wants things to stay the way they are. And so, Loyalists often were not happy with what the British had done, but they also were kind of realist. The British really didn't do that much to us. They didn't really tax us that much. They didn't really try to, they're not really controlling us that much. So, many of them saw that the situation wasn't that bad, and they were concerned with what would happen if there's a revolution. Could that lead to anarchy? Could that lead to chaos? Could that lead to a mob rule? They simply saw that as, that's a dangerous way to go. So their notion was keep things the way they are now. It's not such a terrible, bad thing, okay? Another thing that we think about the Loyalists is that they were just simply practical. And they made an assumption that the British would win any conflict. The British would win a war. I mean, who are you going to vote? Who are you going to vote for? Are you going to go, or I should have said bet. Who are you going to bet on, of course? Are you going to bet on the Americans, 13 disunited colonies, of course, minimal military apparatus and hardly any kind of navy whatsoever? Or the strongest country in the world with a huge economy, a huge navy, a huge military apparatus, lots of money. Who are you going to go with here, of course? The Loyalists said, this is a no-brainer. The British are going to come, they're going to kick butt here. So part of it was sort of their practical notions. Another thing, and this is interesting because it's a representation of the political culture of the Americans. The Loyalists were believers in representative government, and one thing that belief holds is majority rule, that the majority should rule. And so one thing that is very true at the moment of the Declaration of Independence, so the very beginning of the war, and that is that the majority of Americans were not for independence. And that's a true statement. The majority of Americans were not for independence. So I'm going to give you the breakdown right here, what's going on in terms of the population. So we're looking at about 20% of the American population being loyalists. Now that, if you want a real number there, that's about 500,000 people. 500,000 people were loyalists. So these are people who were dedicated and openly supportive of Great Britain, wanting to keep ties to the British Empire. 40% of the Americans were patriots. So patriots are those who are openly and dedicatedly moving towards independence. They want independence, of course, and they're willing to stand up and fight against the British. Now, if you do the math there, of course, that's 60% of the population, so it leaves us with another 40%. And of course, the question, what are they all about? And that was a question that they had for themselves too, So 40% of the people in that moment were undecided. They just didn't know, And I always wonder where I would fall if I'm not necessarily a real brave person, Would I have been a loyalist? It's not so bad, let's stick with them. Would I have been brave enough and courageous enough? No, let's go for it, we need to be independent. I got a feeling I'm going to fall down here. Like, I don't know. I never seem to know, okay? If there was a confused party of America, I would be the head of the confused party of America, because I feel like I'm routinely kind of confused by everything. So anyway, what the Loyalists did was they simply did a little bit of a math here, only 40% of the American people are for independence, and 60% are either against it or undecided, so that's actually a majoritarian expression. Now, what the Loyalists couldn't know, of course, is that as soon as the war starts, as soon as there's action, as soon as the redcoats begin to manifest, the undecided crew decide, and I'm sure you guys know they are not going loyalist, they are going patriotic. So that means ultimately it is 20% of the population loyalists, 80%, the overwhelming majority of the Americans, of course, are for independence, become part of the patriotic element. So anyway, if I said they're wrong, 20% are loyalists, of course, 80% are the patriots. Now this leads me with the final kind of issue associated with the Loyalists, and it's kind of like what happened here, okay? And as you can imagine, things are not going to go well for the Loyalists. They become part of a sort of tragic story of outcome relative to the American Revolution. What you think about is like, who lost the American Revolution? Now, of course the Americans didn't lose the American Revolution. They'll be the victors, and they established their independent country. The British, I can't feel sorry for them. They lose America, and then they go on to rule the world for the next 100 years. Who the hell cares? They're going to have their huge overseas empire. They're the richest country in the world, in the 19th century. Okay, they lost the colonies, but there's nothing really major that they're losing in that sense. So if we're going to look to see who lost the American Revolution, it's the Loyalists, okay? The Loyalists become, I'm going to call it, the big losers. Let's just say that at the very beginning, of course, of the conflict, they put an L on their hat because they wanted to let everyone know they were loyalists. Well, by the end of the war, of course, that L is representing losers. I mean this in the kindest way. It's a situation of absolute pathos. They are the losers of the American Revolution. They will pay a very high price for their activities. And I have to tell you, one of the things that's just kind of horrible about the American Revolution, the most vicious violence of the war is not between Americans and British, it's between Americans and Americans. The Loyalists and the Patriots just hated each other with extreme passion, and some of the worst atrocities of the war are committed by Patriots on Loyalists or Loyalists on Patriots. I mean, this is horrible stuff, essentially. So in the aftermath of the war, of course, the Patriots are going to want to make the Loyalists pay. So they will be harassed in a very significant kind of way. You guys ever heard of the tar and feathering? This was done to Loyalists in the aftermath of it all. It sounds just like an annoyance to put tar on someone's body and then feathers on top of that, but it could be lethal. The tar, to be able to apply it, had to be viscous. And for tar to be viscous, it has to be hot, it has to be heated. So they would heat the tar, the same way they would heat the tar like to do a roof or something like that, put it on the body. Sometimes the person who was tarred and feathered would die from their burns. I mean, they're burned over their body, basically. So, and the feathers are just clearly an insult, of course. They would ride them out of town on a rail. I've never heard of this one before, but they'd take the Loyalists on a long pole, people holding the pole on both ends. They would tie the Loyalists' hands and foot. They would put the pole between their legs and then just kind of bounce them out of town, which is both extremely uncomfortable, of course, but also allowed people to be spitting on them, hitting them with sticks and rocks and stuff on the way. And I have to tell you that there were some Loyalists who were just simply out and out killed. This is the American attitude to the Loyalists. Was stated in this one thing that the Loyalist was a person who had their body in America and their head in England with a neck that needed stretching. Okay, so clearly, a tremendous animosity on the part of the Americans towards the Loyalists. Now, in the end, the question becomes, there's 500,000 of these people, 500,000 Loyalists. What are they going to do? Well, most of them simply faded back into the larger American society. There wasn't much they could do. I have a feeling many of them moved, right? It makes sense. Go someplace else where they don't know you, where they didn't know you were a loyalist, where they're not going to hold that against you. But I've even in my class had students come up to me and say, my family was a Loyalist family. So the Loyalists, will continue on as Americans. The vast majority of them will do that. Very few went back to Great Britain, and those who did often found themselves kind of, not seen as, a group apart there. There was no significant integration for them there, and a lot of hostility from the British. I do want to tell you about one particular group. So about 100,000 of the Loyalists simply said, we cannot live in America. They felt a sense of powerful betrayal on what had happened in America. So we see about 100,000 of them fleeing to Canada. They're going to run to Canada. And they're going to settle primarily on the shores, the northern shores of Lake Ontario. Their primary settlement location will become known to us as a city called Toronto. And the critical factor is that they will become the foundation and the base of the English-speaking population of Canada. So these were Americans who simply decided that this was someplace that they could go to get away from America. I took a class in Canadian history from a professor from McGill University back when I was at Fresno State. And when he was describing the Loyalists, he basically said that they create a tradition of anti-American feelings that endures in Canada even to this day. And Canada's kind of got that weird situation that, the vast majority of their population lives within 100 miles of the American border. They're all down in the southern part of the whole thing. There's about 25 million of them. There's about 300 plus million of us, of course. A huge impact of North America, the whole kind of things. But and the Canadians, of course, interact with us, and we see them as being very nice and polite. But this professor really suggested that there were certain kind of continuing expressions of anti-Americanism that are part of the Canadian experience, including even the national anthem, which of course, "O Canada, we stand on guard for thee." Now the question is, who are you standing on guard against? Maybe it's standing on guard against the Americans and the powerful impact that they might have in Canada. Anyway, the Loyalists become for us, of course, the suggestion of the divided states of America, and really powerfully, of course, a suggestion of just the difficulties of the American Revolution. It was going to be a hard war, of course, and the fact that they were divided makes it even that much more harder. So I'm going to take another break right now, okay? We'll see you soon.